The first globalisation that we'll explore we've called first languages. Humans as a species have filled the whole of the world with their presence. They are creative, a very creative species, but historically they were isolated. And as a consequence of that isolation, they came up with very different ways of expressing meaning. So we have the flowering of very many first languages, those languages that existed on the planet before we had writing.
First languages sort of aligns with First Nations, and some of the images you're going to see as we're speaking are images from Aboriginal Australia. So this is based on research that Mary and I did about literacy in Aboriginal communities in Australia over a number of years.
Many Indigenous peoples who have survived and live today still use their mother tongues, use these first languages. In fact, since that time till the present, we have over 7,000 languages in the world. If we take one example like Australia and to see the phenomenon of first languages, there were over 500 languages and dialects in the Australian continent before the British. However, in just over 230 years, these 500 languages have been reduced to 145, and of these, 110 of them are endangered, and only 12 have a chance of surviving into the future, and that is because they've been documented or turned into writing.
Looking at Australia, we actually see a picture of what the whole of the world would have been like, 10, 15,000 years ago. Originally, language was spoken by relatively small populations, by relatively small groups, and that there were very surprisingly large differences between languages. So human beings developed these very, very variant ways of speaking about the world. So even in Australia, there are some quite remarkably important language differences across different Aboriginal languages, as there are through, Indonesia and, in fact, nearly all of the world's languages, extant languages, are in fact in New Guinea and Australia and that part of the world, in terms of just the raw number of languages.
These first languages on the planet and the ones that still exist were always dynamic, continue to be dynamic. They were associated with complex cultures and epistemologies. But typically, these languages were spoken by very small populations. In Australia, each language was about 1,000 people who were nomadic and moved around the continent. There were very large differences between the languages because of the size of the country and the isolation of the communities.
Now, what's interesting about these languages is not only are they very different from each other, there are differences within those languages. So, for example, let's say in northeast Arnhem in Australia, there's a group of people called the Yolngu. It's a few thousand people, and that's all it ever was. But within those languages, there are important differences by age. The young people speak a particular language, but as you get older, women and men speak different languages, and then elders speak secret and sacred languages. And clans, different family groups in different parts of the country speak different dialects. And what's interesting is there's kind of a logic about those differences. And we're used to living with standardisation in the world that we're in today. But the logic is the logic of my specific relationship to the world and who I am in the world is the specific and unique way in which I speak about the world and name the aspects of the world.
If you can imagine a country the size of America with only 350 or 750,000 people, you can understand kind of the complexity and the differences that were able to emerge as people lived in different parts of the land.
So what we had in these first languages was extraordinary multilingualism as well, because in order to be able to speak to neighbouring peoples, people often spoke 3, 4, 5 different languages as a matter of course. The other thing too is that these were dynamic languages. The languages we have today are stabilised by dictionaries and grammars and literacy teaching practices. But in fact, just to give you one example from the Aboriginal world is when somebody died, their name couldn't be mentioned again, but their name was also a totem which related to a feature of the landscape or or an animal, and the world was constantly being renamed. Things were, there's a lot of dynamism, a lot of movement in these languages.
These communities were also multilingual because although they were isolated, they did actually come together. So they did form lingua francas in order to communicate or to exchange different things that they needed to exchange. There were lots of changes in meaning as life changed, as seasons changed, as relationships changed, depending on skin or totem or the passing away of individuals or the birth of individuals. So the dynamic changing nature of the language was part of its resilience.
And the final point was these languages were deeply multimodal. So, and in a sense, what we had is communication systems just as sophisticated as written language, but around art, around images. Often it was body paint, around dance, around gesture. And so what there were these elaborate symbolic systems which we don't regard as literacy now, but in fact performed that function of literacy. So multimodality was deeply written into these languages.